beaten blind by a cruel schoolmaster. A Lakota chief took her in and gave her sight again. The mare smelled her before I did. I was 2 miles out from the winter camp, riding the ridge to check the creek crossing. It had iced hard the night before, and I wanted to know if the horses could still get to water without breaking through, and old Schoolmaster stopped and put her ears flat forward and wouldn't move. She wasn't afraid. She was listening. I let her stand and I listened too, and after a long moment I heard it, a sound like a small wind caught in a crack, high and thin and wrong for the land. I rode down off the ridge into the cutbank draw below and found her sitting in the snow against a cottonwood root, her knees pulled to her chest, her hands over her face. She was wearing a gray dress that had been good once. It was not good anymore. Her hair was dark and loose and full of burrs, and there was blood dried at her collar, dark brown against the pale fabric, a wide stain that had soaked and dried over what must have been many hours. Her feet were in thin shoes, not winter shoes, not plain shoes, the shoes of someone who had been indoors and then was suddenly not. I got down and crouched where she could hear me, and I said in English that I would not hurt her. She took her hands away from her face. I will say this once, and I will not dress it up. What had been done to her eyes had been done by a man with a leather strap, and it had been done more than once, and recently. Her face was swollen beyond what a night in cold air could account for. Both eyes were sealed shut with dried blood, and with the kind of swelling that comes from a sustained and deliberate beating, not from a single blow. She turned her head toward the sound of my voice the way a person turns toward a sound when they cannot use their eyes. She said, "I can't see anything." I said, "I know." I said, "Can you stand?" She tried. Her legs had gone stiff in the cold and she couldn't get them under her. I put my hands under her arms and brought her up and held her until the blood moved back into her legs and she stopped shaking. She gripped my forearms with both hands. Her grip was hard. Whatever she'd come through, the grip of her hands told me she had not surrendered to it. She asked me what I was. I told her I was Mato Ska, White Bear, chief of a band camped 2 miles north. I told her my people would not harm her. I told her she needed to get warm and she needed someone to look at her eyes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't have anywhere else to go." I lifted her onto Schoolmaster. The mare stood steady. I led her on foot the 2 miles back to camp, walking in the snow, checking the ground ahead for ice. It was slow going and it was cold, and I will tell you that at no point in those 2 miles did I think about what the others would say. I thought about keeping her upright on the horse and keeping her talking so she would stay awake, because I was not certain she didn't have a head injury under all that blood. Her name was Clara Marsh. She had been a student at an Indian school 60 miles south and east of where I found her. I didn't ask her the name of the school or the name of the man who had beaten her. Those things didn't matter to me that day, and I was not going to make her say them in the cold with her face swollen shut. She'd run when she got the chance. She'd been running 2 days. She said she thought she was going east, but she might have been going in circles because after the second day she couldn't be sure of the sun's position anymore. I thought 2 days. 2 days in January on the plains with no winter gear, no food, no sight. She was alive because she had refused to lie down. My daughter Winona was 17 that winter. She had her mother's good hands, careful and sure, and she did not flinch when she looked at what had been done to Clara's face. She boiled water and she cleaned the wounds with clean cloth, and with a mixture of things she had learned from her grandmother, a poultice of specific plants we kept dried for exactly the injuries that leave a man or a woman unable to open their eyes. I sat outside the lodge while this happened. I am telling you this because there are men who would have sat inside and watched and called it concern. I did not do that. I sat outside in the cold and I smoked and I waited, and after a long time Winona came out and she said, "The eyes themselves are not destroyed. The swelling is very bad and one of the blows caught the edge of the socket and she may carry a scar there, but it is not permanent. She will see again." I said, "How long?" Winona said, "Weeks, maybe more." I nodded and I smoked and I looked at the sky. She said, "Father, who did this?" I said, "A man at a school." Winona looked at me for a moment, then she said, "She can stay." I said, "Yes." In the morning Clara woke and she was in pain and frightened and she didn't know for several seconds where she was or why she couldn't see. I heard it from outside, the sharp intake of breath, the catch of panic. I heard Winona speak to her, low and steady, the same tone she used with green horses. And then I heard Clara's breathing slow. She stayed in Winona's lodge. That was proper. A woman without kin stays with women. That is how it has always worked with my people, and it was the right arrangement in every way. Winona fed her and sat with her and talked with her for hours. Clara spoke a little Lakota. The school had required the children to speak English only, but Clara had learned a few words from the other students in secret. The way you learn things that are forbidden, the way those things stay with you longer because of it. I came in the evenings. I told myself it was to check on her condition. Winona, who had her mother's other quality, the quality of seeing through a man's stated reasons directly to his actual ones, said nothing about this, but I noticed she found reasons to be outside the lodge when I arrived. Clara sat against the rolled sleeping hides with her hands in her lap. Her face was still swollen, but less so each day. By the fourth evening she had opened one eye a slit, just a slit, no more than that, but enough to register light and shadow. She turned toward the lamp when I lit it. I watched her do it and felt something move in my chest that I did not have a name for in English, though I had a name for it in Lakota, the feeling of a thing that had been nearly gone coming back. I would sit across from her and she would talk and I would answer, and sometimes she would ask me things. She asked about the land. She asked where we were relative to the rivers and I told her, and she said she had grown up not far from the Missouri and had known some of the river men when she was small. She asked about my wife. I told her Tashina had been dead 6 years. She said she was sorry. I said it was a long time ago, and that was true, and it was also not entirely true, and I thought she heard both things in the way I said it, because she nodded in a way that wasn't dismissive. She asked me one evening, "Why did you bring me in?" I said, "Because you were in the snow." She said, "Other men would have ridden past." I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you?" I thought about it. I said, "Because you were alive and fighting to stay that way. A person like that deserves a hand." She turned her face toward me, one eye still sealed, the other a sliver of dark brown, and she said, "You're a good man, White Bear." No one had said that to me in a long time, not because it wasn't true. Because there was no one left who had the standing to say it. My wife had said it. My wife had been the last person whose saying of it carried the full weight of meaning. When Tashina said a thing, she meant it all the way down to the ground, and after her, there was no one whose words had that same weight. I looked at this woman with her wrecked face and her thin gray dress and her hands with the half-healed cuts across the knuckles, and I did not say anything in return. I put more wood on the fire, and after a while I went back to my own lodge. Weeks passed. The swelling went. The bruising faded through purple and yellow and brown, and then to almost nothing, a faint shadow at the orbit of her left eye that Winona said would likely remain but would not be disfiguring. Clara's sight came back unevenly, the right eye first, shapes before details, then details. The left eye a week behind that. One morning she woke and she could see Winona's face clearly for the first time, and she cried, not loudly but steadily, for a long time, and Winona held her. I know this because Winona told me. I was not there. What I was there for was the afternoon 3 weeks in when she walked out of the lodge on her own legs and stood in the winter light and turned her face up to the sky and opened her eyes. I was working a leather trace near the horse pen and I watched her do it. She stood like that for a long time. Then she turned and found me with her eyes, really found me, looked directly at me, recognized me by sight for the first time, and she put one hand up to her own face, and she touched the scar at the edge of her left eye. She walked over to where I was working. She said, "I can see you." I said, "I can see that." She looked at me for a long moment. There was nothing wrong in the way she looked. No charity in it, no gratitude performed, no debt being paid. She was looking at me the way you look at something that is plainly itself, simply and without decoration. I am a man of 61 years. My hair had been gray for a decade. I have scars from things I will not name here, and my hands are not the hands of a young man, and I have not been young in a long time. I know what I look like. I know that what I look like is not what draws a young woman's eye. She looked at me that way for a long moment, and then she said, "I'd like to stay." I said, "It is winter. The plains are not safe for a woman alone." She said, "That's not why I want to stay." I didn't answer that. I went back to working the leather, but I did not tell her she couldn't stay. There is a thing I have to tell you about what it means for a man like me to have someone under his protection. I had been chief of this band for 22 years. My word on a matter was the final word, and I had worked for 22 years to make sure that word was worth the weight people put on it. I had ridden into things that killed better men and come out the other side, not because I was lucky, but because I was careful, and because I thought in 3 and 4 steps where other men thought in 1. I had kept my people fed in hard winters, and I had kept them out of certain fights that would have ended badly, and I had negotiated with men I did not respect in order to get outcomes that served my people. And I had done all of this without bending my back further than it needed to bend. And I had done it alone since Tashina died. A chief without a good woman beside him is a complete chief. The work still gets done. The decisions still get made. I am not saying otherwise. But there is a thing that a good woman sees in a man, not what he performs for others, not the posture and the protocol, but the actual man, the one that exists when there is no counsel and no negotiation, and being seen that way, and being found good by that sight, is a different kind of thing than being respected. Tashina had seen me that way. I did not expect to have that again. Spring came. The creeks unfroze and the grass came up and the ponies shed their winter coats in great ragged patches that the camp dogs tried to eat. Clara had learned over the winter how to work a hide with a scraper. She had learned to do it properly, the way Winona's grandmother had taught, the angle of the scraper, the pressure, the rotation of the hide, and she was good at it, not with the efficiency of a lifetime but with the precision of someone who pays close attention. She had also, over the winter, continued to learn Lakota. She had a good ear and she was not afraid to say a word wrong and be corrected, which is the only way to actually learn a thing. And by spring she could carry on a full conversation if the other person was patient. And several of the older women were patient with her because they liked her, which is not something the older women gave easily. In the spring, men from the agent's office came to the camp. There were 3 of them and they had a paper and they said there was a girl. They said girl. She was 23 years old, they said girl, who had run from a school and was believed to be with my band, and they were there to collect her. I walked out to meet them. I will not dress this up either. I told them there was no such person in my camp. I told them they were welcome to look, knowing they would not look, knowing that the paper in their hands only meant something if I decided it meant something. I was aware of exactly where my best men were positioned in the camp as I was saying this. I was aware that the agent's men were aware of exactly where my best men were positioned. I was also aware that it was spring, and the newspapers back east were full of things that made certain officials reluctant to initiate a confrontation with a band of Lakota over a single runaway girl. The agent's men left. That evening Clara came to my lodge. She sat down across from me and she said, "I heard what happened." I said, "Nothing happened." She said, "You told them I wasn't here." I said, "I told them there was no such person. That is a different thing." She looked at me. That same look, clear and direct, no dead in it. She said, "White Bear, they'll come back. And when they do, it won't just be 3 men with a paper." I said, "I know that." She said, I don't want you to have trouble because of me. I said, this is my land. Any trouble that comes here is not because of you. She was quiet, then she said, I want to tell you something. I waited. She said, when you found me in that draw, I had been sitting there for about 4 hours. I had told myself I would wait until I heard something, a sound of camp horses, anything, and if I didn't hear it, I was going to lie down in the snow. Not to sleep, to stop. I was going to stop. I looked at her. She said, you were the sound I heard. I didn't say anything for a long while. Outside the lodge someone was singing, one of the older women, a low working song she sang when she was doing something with her hands. I said, I'm glad the mayor stopped. Clara looked at me. Then she said, plainly and without decoration, I love you. I want you to know that, not because you saved me, because of who you are. I've watched you all winter, and I know who you are. I am 61 years old, and I have ridden at the front of a war party, and I have stood in rooms with men who wanted to take everything I had, and I have buried my wife, and I have done all of it without letting my face show what was happening inside. I sat across from this woman with her almost healed scar and her good clear eyes, and I felt the inside of my chest like a green thing cracking open in spring. I said, I'm a man of 61 years. She said, I know how old you are. I said, I am not what you'd have chosen if the world had given you a better set of choices. She said very calmly, don't tell me what I'd have chosen. I sat with that for a while. Then I said, my wife's name was Tashina. She died 6 years ago of a fever that shouldn't have killed her but did. I have not let myself want a thing for myself since she died. Not one thing. Everything I have done has been for my people or for my children, and that is not a complaint. That is just what it has been. Clara reached across and put her hand over mine, where it rested on my knee. She didn't say anything, she just left it there. I looked down at her hand on mine. I said, I want you to stay. She said, I know I'm staying. We were married in the Lakota way in early summer, when the wild roses were out along the creek. Winona made Clara a dress from a hide she'd been working since February, which told me Winona had known how this was going to end from considerably earlier than I had known it myself. The older women painted Clara's hands and face with the red ochre. That means a woman has been chosen and has chosen well. And they sang the songs that are sung when a chief takes a wife. I have been to many weddings in my life. I have been to the kind that are performed in churches with stiff collars and a minister reading words from a book, and I have been to the kind that happen around a fire with the whole band watching and the drum going, and the sky very big overhead. I will tell you that the kind with the drum and the sky is the kind that goes all the way into a man, the kind that he carries the rest of his life like a stone in his pocket. Something to put his hand on when the trail gets hard, and he needs to remember why he is walking it. She stood beside me in the dress Winona had made, and the red ochre was on her face, and her eyes were clear and steady, and she held my hand the same way she had reached across in the lodge that night, quietly, without performance, with the weight of a woman who knows what she means and means what she does. There was no part of that moment that felt like charity. I will tell you what the rest has been briefly, because the rest is less a story than a life, and a life does not have the shape of a story. The agent's men came back once more that fall, with more men and a different paper. I had been expecting this, and I had arranged for certain things to be known in advance. Things about the legal standing of a married woman, things about which politicians owed which other politicians a measure of good sense, and they went away again and did not come back. Clara learned everything Winona could teach her. She became, over a few years, someone the women of the camp went to when they needed someone with a steady hand and a clear eye, and an ability to deal with the world outside the camp in its own language. She never lost her Lakota, which had become by then genuinely fluent, but she kept her English sharp in the way a tool kept sharp is kept, against the need for it. She sat in on every council where it was proper for her to sit. When it was not proper for her to sit, she told me afterward what she would have said, and a number of times what she would have said was exactly what needed to be said. I told her this once and she said, "Then you already knew it." I said, "I knew it differently when I heard it from you." She considered that and nodded and said, "Yes, that's how it works." We had a son. He was born in the winter and we called him Tate, which means wind, because he arrived in a wind. He has his mother's eyes and my hands, and neither of us can determine yet which of us to blame for his obstinacy. Here is where I have arrived at, and I will tell it plainly because there is no other way to tell the truth about a life. I was a man who had done his job for 22 years and done it well, and who had no one at the end of each day who looked at him with the eyes of someone who had chosen him freely, not for what he could provide, not for the title or the standing, not out of obligation or gratitude, who had chosen him because they knew him and had found the knowing to be enough. That is the thing you do not know you are missing until it comes back. And when it comes back, you know it immediately, the way you know the smell of rain before the rain arrives, the way you know a sound you heard once a very long time ago and had begun to believe you had imagined. It is late now and the fire is down, and Clara is asleep with the boy between us, and the boy has kicked the robe half off himself the way he does every night, and in a few minutes I will pull it back up over him. The camp is quiet. Outside there is snow on the ground, just a little, the first snow of the season, and it is bright under the moon. I will tell you what my life looks like from where I sit. It looks like enough. It looks like everything I did not ask for, and would not have thought to ask for, and that I am grateful to have been given. The mare stopped. That is all. The mare stopped, and I listened, and I walked down into that draw. And a woman who had been left for nothing put her hands on my arms and held on, and she has not let go since, and neither have I.